In many ways, Silksong is immune to criticism. Team Cherry developed Hollow Knight, arguably one of the best indie games ever made and the peak of its genre. Even with only one game to their name, Hollow Knight was so great it granted them near infinite goodwill. The hype for Silksong grew unreal as the 7-year development meme spiraled out of control and fans put the mania in Metroidvania. Silksong stopped being a sequel and became a kind of internet cryptid, glimpsed once in a while at gaming showcases before disappearing back into the shadows. Hollow Knight benefited not only from the breadth and quality of its content, but also and especially because of its bargain price. Silksong follows suit at an overly generous $20 when Team Cherry could have easily justified charging more and players would have happily paid. Another big reason for the hype around Silksong that shouldn't go unmentioned is every way in which it's not like how the AAA gaming industry has been operating recently. It's not $80. It doesn't have microtransactions or a battle pass. It's not packed with ray tracing that melts the average user's graphics card. It's not buggy. Well, actually it's filled with bugs, but these are the kind of bugs I can get behind. The point is, while Silksong rightfully received its hype based on its own merits, a lot of that can definitely be placed on the current climate of the video game industry. Let's be real, if you were going to buy Silksong, you already did, which means this review isn't really a review, but rather a critique of Silksong as a piece of art. Think of this less as a buyer's guide and more as a post-mortem. In that regard, it serves as validation for those who agree with my arguments and, as I'll undoubtedly be accused of by detractors, media-illiterate blather from a scrub who just needs to get good. Silksong has many admirable qualities, enough that I'm confident it'll be some people's new favorite game of all time, standing alongside or even surpassing Hollow Knight. But on the other hand, it has some egregious issues that severely hold it back, not just from reaching the same heights, but maybe from even being a good game at all. There'll be light spoilers and some footage from areas and bosses later in the game. This video assumes you've played or are at least familiar with Hollow Knight and Silksong, but I'll make an effort to explain things for those who aren't. There were two things on most people's minds before Silksong's release. How similar to Hollow Knight would it be, and how good would it be? Note that's how good. Whether Silksong would be a good game was never a debate and simply assumed to be a given. After playing it, I don't think it should have been. Silksong is quite similar to Hollow Knight, although with enough differences to set it apart as its own experience. But regarding how good it is, that's a more complicated answer. It feels like the major directive behind Silksong's design was to be a bigger and more bombastic Hollow Knight in every way. It has many qualities reminiscent of Hollow Knight for both good and bad. It should also be noted that many of the negatives I'll be discussing were also present in Hollow Knight. While I loved the first game, it does have problems and their continuation into Silksong shouldn't get a free pass. It's actually worse that known complaints about the first game haven't been addressed and in many cases are worse than they were before. First, credit where it's due. Silksong boasts some admirable surface-level polish. The art is incredible, from the beautiful environments, the detailed backgrounds, and the creative bug-inspired character designs. Each area is distinct and has its own atmosphere, with some inspiring a sense of grandeur not even present in Hollow Knight. The controls are still mostly tight and responsive. It feels good to control Hornet. In fact, when it comes specifically to controlling your character, Silksong's platforming often feels even better than Hollow Knight's, especially once you unlock more of her moveset. You can now heal in midair and heal for multiple masks at once, which was a welcome change. The music by Christopher Larkin still lends itself well to the game, nicely adding to the general atmosphere of exploration and intensity of battles. And finally, of course, the sheer amount of content is impressive, especially for its price. Silksong has a bigger map and is significantly longer than Hollow Knight. My playthrough clocked in at around 64 hours, although I was trying to 100% the game and messed around a lot, so players who are less focused on side activities should expect a ballpark of maybe 10 or 15 to 20 hours less than that. My main issues with Silksong are its extremely unforgiving and unfair difficulty, an overly large and confusing map with too few fast travel locations and save points spread too far apart, general jankiness and annoyance with mechanics and game feel, such as pogo movement, lackluster equipment and abilities, runbacks, and damage hitboxes, and a lack of interesting or memorable characters in an unnecessarily obtuse story. I replayed Hollow Knight 2 days before Silksong's release in preparation and to re-familiarize myself with the controls, game feel, and world, and as a sort of encore playthrough. Funnily enough, it turns out the first boss I'd face wasn't a beetle with blades, but the Steam store page. I was up bright and early at 7 AM the day of release, and so many people were trying to buy Silksong at the same time that almost every major game platform store crashed, which meant my adventure wouldn't begin for a few more hours. Given the hype surrounding it, it was an odd choice for Team Cherry not to enable pre-orders to avoid exactly this scenario. In retrospect, that lack of attention would be foreshadowing for the game to come. Never before has my opinion of a game changed so much so often. Like Hornet herself, my feelings kept bouncing around wildly from good to bad and back again, sometimes soaring, other times slamming face first into spikes. I often found myself cursing at the screen and wanting to tear my hair out. Yet at the same time, I can't deny how much sleep I lost over the game as I kept playing into the wee hours of the night. Although things began promisingly enough, my early impressions of Silksong quickly soured. It looked, sounded, and felt like Hollow Knight, but as the hours passed, I couldn't help but feel something was off. Enemies seemed too difficult, the map seemed more confusing, and the game seemed a lot stingier with giving out currency, to name a few issues. It's kinda like reconnecting with an uncle you haven't seen in years only to find out he's racist. Sure, he's still fun to hang out with, but every so often he starts going on about them Orientals and you just have to cringe and bear it. I've heard some players find the number of different directions open to you in Hollow Knight's first major area, the Forgotten Crossroads, daunting. Silksong is like that, exaggerated fivefold. There are so many directions and points of interest within the first few hours of the game, it's overwhelming. It's also much harder than Hollow Knight. Enemy attacks, their movement, damage, and environmental hazards are all much harder. I was constantly starved for enough currency to cover my expenses. Rosary beads, which replace Geo, are essentially needed to buy everything and have costs steep enough to where I felt I never had enough. Now obviously, I'm familiar with Hollow Knight multiple playthroughs over, so there's that caveat. Yet despite that, I feel Silksong is plainly much harder. The most immediate source of discomfort is the new diagonal pogo. True to her movement from Hollow Knight, rather than sword swiping down, known as pogoing, Hornet lunges diagonally. The pogo is imperative in Hollow Knight for things like attacking enemies in the air and striking spikes to traverse platforming sections. The new diagonal movement from Hornet is incredibly unwieldy, although you do get used to it eventually. I've always played Hollow Knight on keyboard. When I launched Silksong, it suggested using a controller as the recommended way to play. I don't recall the same suggestion when I booted up Hollow Knight for the first time, but I assumed Team Cherry knew what they were doing and went along with it. Obviously, different people have their own preferences when it comes to keyboard versus controller, and at first using a controller was fine. But for the life of me, I don't know how anyone could implement the precision platforming that's required with the diagonal pogo using a controller thumbstick. Eventually, I gave up and switched back to keyboard and had to unlearn the controller inputs. There are now two separate currencies that enemies drop, rosary beads and shell shards. For many hours, I had no idea what shell shards even did because the game is so vague when it comes to explaining its core mechanics and giving you directions. Shell shards are initially capped at 400 for some reason, which means they're limited and you feel like you're wasting pickups when you already have them maxed. But it doesn't matter because I almost never used them except for the 2 times a quest specifically asked me for them as payment. Rosary beads are the main currency you'll be using anyway, and the game is far too stingy with them given how many you need and how often you need them. It doesn't help that half or more of the enemies you kill give out shell shards instead. It felt like I was always in debt, which is pretty disheartening when you need to pay for incredibly important things like maps, benches, and fast travel points, just to name a few. The game seems to go out of its way to troll the player. At one point, I finally found a bench to rest at, only for a trap to trigger and kill me. It wouldn't be the only time either. When the Dark Souls devs were asked why they never made a bonfire mimic, they said because then players wouldn't trust any bonfires moving forward. I cannot confirm they were right because for the rest of the game, I never felt comfortable resting at a new bench when at low health and always braced for the rug to be pulled out from under me. One time I paid to open a door and decided to see what was past it on screen first, only for the door to close and have to pay to open it again. Later on, I died twice without retrieving a substantial chunk of rosary beads, losing them permanently. Honestly, what is the point of this mechanic? All it does is punish players for exploring unfamiliar areas and fighting enemies rather than running past everything. It baffles me that Souls-like developers keep putting this in their games. The experience made me want to quit on the spot. If I hadn't passed the 2-hour mark, I would have refunded the game on Steam. And then I got stuck in an area and had no idea how to leave because the game communicates your objectives so poorly. So after 4.5 hours of wandering around confused, frustrated, and getting stuck, I decided to cool off, gave it a day, and started a fresh run. Having got my bearings and being more familiar with the map layout and what I needed to prioritize, the second run proceeded a lot more smoothly and I finally had fun for a long stretch of the game. However, that newfound positivity wouldn't last. I've lost track of the number of times while playing Silksong I've exclaimed out loud to myself words to the effect of, "Are you kidding me? What were they thinking? And this is so bad," along with many other statements unsuitable for YouTube. Silksong's map is once again a mess and in many ways worse than before. It's even bigger, maze-like, and has too few save benches and fast travel points spread too far apart. I was going to say how it's especially bad early on when you don't have the lay of the land, but on reflection, it continues to be a problem throughout the whole game. It's a pain to get around even after unlocking the dash ability, with important NPCs and merchants sometimes 5 minutes away from the nearest fast travel point. And that's before mentioning some maps have no fast travel at all and, in some cases, only a single save bench for the entire level. Some maps just dead end once you reach their final boss fight, with no quick way of returning to the starting point. I'd often use quitting to the menu as a way to avoid backtracking. If you're deep in a level and come across a new bench, it can be a legitimate debate whether to ignore it so you can maintain your previous save point. As a result, boss runbacks are incredibly annoying. If you die on a boss, why can't you just have the option to retry it immediately, like how the boss Dream fights were in the first game? Sometimes there's literally no enemies along the way or any tricky platforming required, yet the game will still waste your time. The worst this gets is in a late game level called Bilewater. There's only one save point at the start of the map, and it can take 5 minutes to run all the way back to the boss room just for another shot at learning his patterns. FromSoft has done irreparable damage to the genre by convincing devs that players love poison swamps. Silksong is no different, with Bilewater including maggot-infested ponds that prevent you from healing if you fall in. Bilewater doesn't just test your patience, it marinates in it. Every death drags you through 10 minutes of deja vu as you're waterboarded through swamp muck. I want you to take a look at this footage sped up to see just how bad this is. Seriously, fuck Bilewater. I don't know if my complaints are in the minority, as I've deliberately not looked at other reviews or fan comments prior to writing this script. For Silksong, I intentionally avoided looking at any videos ahead of time. I enjoy playing these types of games going in knowing as little as possible. Bilewater is one of the few times the game broke me and I looked for help online. I just couldn't believe the whole level had only one save point. Turns out it doesn't, and there's a secret hidden bench further into it. The number one thought running through my mind as I played Silksong was that this is a game with fun core game systems like its platforming and combat, sabotaged by frustratingly baffling design choices at every turn. Secrets and hidden areas should be for small treasures like geocaches, mask shards, and lore tablets, not basic life support. A hidden bench isn't a reward, it's a fire exit with the lights turned off. The hidden bench in Bilewater does make the runback more tolerable, but it still doesn't excuse this type of design that just wastes your time. The new map seller is often a lot harder to find than Cornifer was. One time she was gated behind learning a new platforming ability found in another entirely separate level. Remember on your first playthrough of Hollow Knight how annoying Fog Canyon was to traverse, with the map staying invisible for most of the game? Silksong has multiple large territories that stay swathed in fog for possibly almost your whole run. Marking the map with generic unnamed pins is still an issue. Very often you'll stumble across an area you can't progress through yet until you come back later with a new item or ability. The problem is, hours after you've left these places, it can be impossible to remember why you couldn't proceed with only a generic unnamed pin as your reminder. Was that a ledge too high to jump to? A locked door that needed a key? A one-way gate that has to be opened from the other side? Something else? This results in either wasting time backtracking to these places only to find you still can't progress, or ignoring unexplored routes until you think you've acquired every possible ability and item. Don't get me wrong, there are levels in Silksong that are impressive and well designed. The Grand Citadel is probably the metaphorical and literal pinnacle of the game, being reminiscent of Elden Ring's Lane Dell, a massive, complex level to explore with multiple sub-areas that interconnect. But I found this was usually the exception, and the majority of the levels were not fun to navigate. The amount of content in the game actually works against its replayability, as getting through it all is an arduous task that reminded me of the worst aspects of Elden Ring, like its boring, bloated cave system. And all of this is before even getting to Silksong's worst design problem, the artificial difficulty. It's become tedious how players feel they have to preemptively justify any complaints they have because of the inevitable discourse around these games. It's always the same boring and predictable argument from someone eager to flex their god gamer status. If you have a problem with the game's difficulty, it's because you just suck. Skill issue, Lamau. So let me be clear that, while Silksong's extreme difficulty is a problem, the bigger issue is specifically in the way it's difficult. Difficulty should be a seasoning that enhances the flavor of a challenge. While Hollow Knight could definitely be very hard, Silksong pours on the salt until the dish is inedible. It's artificially difficult in a way that's unfun and designed to frustrate the player rather than challenge them. It feels like Team Cherry picked Godhome's Pantheons as the template for how difficult the entire base game should be. I've beaten Nightmare King Grim, considered one of the hardest bosses in the first game, and let me tell you, some of the segments in Silksong make him look like a chump. Boss fights have only one of two difficulties, either slightly too easy or ridiculously hard, with far more of the latter. Remember how not enabling pre-orders resulted in online stores crashing? Team Cherry said they weren't aware of how hyped the game was. From the few interviews they've done, it sounds like they're terminally offline. I can't help but speculate the feedback they got about Hollow Knight was from only a few veteran experts who wanted a more difficult challenge in the sequel. Either that, or Team Cherry designed this game as a self-indulgent exercise to please themselves first and only thought about players second. Way more benches now require payment to unlock, to the point where it feels like all of them do. That's on top of needing to pay for everything else, like maps and fast travel points. I didn't like that you had to pay for those things in Hollow Knight, but it's even worse here, with an abysmal ratio of high price points and stingy enemy drops. More enemies drop shell shards alone rather than rosary beads. This makes permanently losing your currency if you die twice even more of a punch in the balls than it otherwise would be. It got to the point where if I was ever in danger of dying before retrieving my beads, I would instantly pause and quit to the menu and start the level over. The damage output from enemies is insane. Nearly every attack hits like a sack of anvils by dealing 2 masks worth of damage, even from normal run-of-the-mill enemies. This isn't even a late game issue either, as the crazy damage output can be seen relatively early on. And although rare, some late game bosses can hit for 3 masks of damage. In addition, you only have 5 masks to start, and the game weighs doling out more towards the late game. You effectively only have 3 health for almost the first 2/3 of the game, meaning you can only get hit twice before dying. And another little poop nugget nestled into the healing system is that if you get hit while healing, you don't just get your heal cancelled, you also still lose the silk expended on it. Imagine if in Dark Souls, when you got hit while healing, it still consumed your Estus flask. The same insane damage also applies to environmental hazards like spikes, lava, and so on. This means that, in a Metroidvania, which is all about exploration, it feels like you're actively punished for exploring new areas. Imagine if the most difficult sections of White Palace dealt 2 damage every time you accidentally ran into a buzzsaw. Now understand, there are even harder platforming sections in Silksong, like a Path of Pain style level where you're on a timer. Take too long getting to the next platform and you start taking damage. Enemies deal contact damage even when they're literally stunned on the ground. Iframes and the duration of invincibility after taking a hit feel like they've been reduced as well. Enemies can juggle you into each other's attacks or knock you into hazards, which means you can take 4 masks worth of damage from one hit. Hitboxes are also wonky, with it sometimes feeling like you get hit by enemies or hazards when they weren't even touching you. Sometimes you take damage while you're actively hitting an enemy. It's like they instantly counter you, or you're getting magnetically pulled into their body. The game is filled with an unbelievable number of flying enemies that attack at range or dodge away from you when you try to counterattack them. Remember how annoying primal aspids were in the first game? How they'd fly away and had a very difficult to dodge triple projectile attack? It can't be understated how much Silksong has tons of enemies like those, but worse. Some enemies use hit and run tactics where it's literally impossible to kill them before they vanish off screen. And while all of this isn't necessarily too hard, it is incredibly annoying. Bosses summon flying enemies into enclosed combat arenas. Sometimes you have to fight a gauntlet of enemy waves before even getting to face the boss, including on the Runback. In many of the game's encounters, it feels like there was no play testing at all. The best example of this to my mind is the Beastfly boss. This is a side quest you get to track down and fight a boss in a lava arena, and I want to explain in detail so you can fully understand how unreasonable it is. The boss dives into and destroys the floor, so you have to keep track of both where it is and where you're standing. It has erratic movement where it moves off screen and you have to guess where it's going to attack from. It usually moves in line with where you are, but not always. You have to jump or not jump to avoid it based on the height it flies at, but depending on where you are when it starts its attack, it can sometimes attack at a middle height. It also summons flying enemies that actively move away from you and attack at range. Remember, everything deals 2 masks of damage. Their projectiles also persist on whatever surface they land on. So you have to keep track of the boss, where it's possibly going to attack from off-screen, collapsed floors, multiple flying enemies, the projectiles they shoot in the air, and the projectiles that land on the ground. Sometimes there's literally no way to not get hit. The game often delights in griefing the player. Trap benches and other pitfalls you have no way of knowing about in advance, including long vertical falls throughout levels that make Silksong feel more like Jump King if you miss a platform. Some boss arenas have exits that stay open during the fight that you can accidentally dash through or fall out of mid-battle, resetting your progress. As I said, the diagonal pogo is unwieldy, but you do eventually get used to it. However, the diagonal movement doesn't continue until you hit something. Rather, it automatically cancels after a short duration. This means you can misjudge how far an enemy is from your position or platform and diagonal pogo into it, only for Hornet to cancel her attack mid-flight and slam into them for contact damage or miss the platform entirely and fall to your death. It would have been one thing if the game committed to designing around the diagonal pogo, but it doesn't. A new addition are crests that change Hornet's moveset and equipment slots. Relatively early, you can get a crest that gives you the original downward pogo, and from then on, there's no reason to ever use any other crest. I stuck with the Wanderer crest for nearly the entire game, although I did try experimenting with the others. I legitimately don't know how you're supposed to traverse many of the game's platforming sections without the downward pogo, making all crests without it effectively useless. Even if that weren't the case, every crest has something about it that sucks, whether that's limited equipment slots or its moveset. Of the crests with a down pogo, Wanderer has the fastest pin swipe, but also a very short attack range, meaning you often get too close to enemies' hitboxes. But the others have frustratingly slow attack speeds. Crests are less a build system for players with different preferences and more a selection of various poison pills. There's also the added fun that whenever you find a new crest, the game automatically saves your location, changes your moveset to it, and removes all your tools until you get back to a bench, including seeing where you are on the map. Like the first game, you can upgrade your nail or pin damage, but doing so is a lot more involved and high effort, and the result feels lackluster. Even after multiple weapon upgrades, regular enemies often still take 3 to 4 hits to kill. In a lot of cases, I didn't notice any difference at all. One of my dislikes about the first game was how the charm system worked. Charms would take up multiple slots, and you could only wear a very limited number of them. Additionally, many charms were simply ineffective and not worth using. As a result, equipping lots of charms to feel more powerful wasn't an option, and various interesting charms that weren't directly related to dealing more damage with the nail were left unused. Silksong replaces charms with tools, and it's a system that's, yet again, the same but worse. Tools are placed into different categories, and you can only have limited amounts of each. If you'd prefer to focus more on combat or exploration, for example, tough luck. You're forced to diversify. There are still de facto mandatory tools like the compass to show your position on the map, which you basically have to keep equipped for the whole game. Once you find the tool that speeds up healing, it'll also be mandatory. The magnet tool, the equivalent of the gathering swarm charm that automatically grabbed fallen currency, is worse. First, it doesn't magnetize shell shards, and second, rosary beads are spherical and roll around all over the map, often falling or rolling through exits and getting destroyed on spikes before the magnet takes effect. This includes rolling through your body initially, so you can't even block them from falling off ledges. Then there's combat tools. These are limited use weapons like throwing knives that augment your combat abilities. They're also what shell shards are used for, ammo that gets spent when you rest at a bench, which is a level of resource management and potential grinding I didn't want added to the game. They're all very limited use anyway, with some as low as only 4 uses before running out. They're so limited that I largely didn't bother with them. If you do use them liberally, you will run low on shell shards. Additionally, some combat tools require you to return to specific NPC merchants and pay to have them replenished. The game is riddled with vague, poorly described explanations for how to complete objectives. Wishes make their debut here, which are Silksong's version of side quests. Almost all of them are miserable and fall into a handful of awful categories. Box ticking, where you have to collect a certain number of items, usually from killing specific enemies. These are essentially the generic and mediocre Slay 20 Rats quest found in numerous RPGs that have historically been the subject of rightly deserved mockery. It's a shame so many of Silksong's missions fall into this category. A lot of the time you have to kill a specific enemy that may only appear in one location, and the item has a variable chance of dropping, meaning even though the quest might say you have to kill 10 of something, you actually have to kill a lot more than that. Often, the game doesn't even show you what specific enemy you're supposed to go after. I actually got soft-locked in my first run, as I said, because I entered an area that required me to gather a specific resource in order to leave, and I had no idea where to get it from. And out of all the things I expected to find in Silksong, it wasn't so many upskirt shot. No, it wasn't AAA Ubisoft slop. Then there's Follow the Breadcrumb Trail quests, where you track down an enemy or NPC by simply following a trail of particles. Annoyingly, they sometimes disappear if you move slightly away from them. That behavior is inconsistent though, because sometimes I'd accidentally leave the screen and come back and they'd still be there. Some quests are simply pay an amount of currency and boom, they're done. How exciting. The grubs from Hollow Knight have been replaced by the Flea Caravan. Outside of the first 5 you collect, I don't recall there being any reward for finding them individually until you get all of them. This is a problem that actually plagues many objectives where it's unclear what reward you got, if any, or where the reward is lackluster given the effort involved. Some examples of particularly atrocious side quests include gathering 10 bells located around the Bellheart map, and that's all the information you're given. After spending an inordinate amount of time wandering around the level killing every enemy I came across, I eventually discovered the bells drop randomly and have nothing to do with slaying enemies, which works differently from every other collect a number of items quest before then. Worse yet, they only spawn once per visit, meaning you have to wander around aimlessly until you find a bell, then leave and reset the level at a bench, and then come back. 10 times. Another contender for worst quest in the game is collecting 5 gourmet items in exchange for weapon upgrade material. Aside from the first 4, which are busy work in their own right, the worst is the meat dish. This is Silksong's delicate flower quest all over again, except served raw with rancid meat that spoils as you sprint through a gauntlet. If you recall, the delicate flower from Hollow Knight was a quest where you had to traverse multiple levels on the map without using fast travel, and if you took damage for any reason, you instantly failed and had to start over. This was tedious, and many players didn't bother completing it, which was mitigated somewhat by the fact that your reward was just a mask shard, so it didn't feel too bad to skip it. In this case, the reward is permanent increased damage, so the incentive is a lot higher, but things are much worse than Delicate Flower. The route to get from point A to B is longer and has more complex platforming, hazards, and enemies to avoid. The meat spoils, meaning you're on a timer and have to move fast. With Delicate Flower, you could take your time, plan a route, and maneuver around enemies. Here, you don't have enough time to recover from many mistakes and have to run basically at full tilt the whole way. While you can take damage without instantly failing, it causes the meat meter to take a significant hit. In practice, I found you could only get hit once and still have enough time to make it. This is actually worse than instantly failing, as players may assume they can still finish and continue running the route even though they've effectively already failed. I eventually completed the quest by killing every single enemy along the route and only then accepting the meat, while still traversing multiple maps without saving or fast traveling, avoiding hazards and some enemies that respawn anyway. The Mist is a late game area that absolutely needed to be reworked. When I initially reached the map, I proceeded as normal until eventually realizing the screens were endlessly looping. I noticed some glowing butterflies and thought they might point in the direction of the true exit, if that was even the right way to proceed, but could never figure out a method to progress. This was another area that, like Bilewater, broke me and I looked up the answer. Turns out you're supposed to use Hornet's music instrument on the butterflies to activate them and follow them to the correct exit. Up to that point, the instrument is only ever used on Weaver gates or certain NPCs or lore elements, so there's no reason to even imagine the possibility that it would affect these butterflies. That's if you even take note of them in the first place rather than just chalking up their presence to be an interesting visual flair for the map. Finally, let's talk about probably the least important but still relevant aspect of Silksong, its story and characters. Hollow Knight did not have a good story. Sacrilege, I know. Following in the Souls-like tradition, it's too vague about what's going on and expects players to play detective to figure it out. When 99% of players don't understand basic elements of your story's world, narrative, and characters without resorting to watching online lore videos, I wouldn't call that an engaging story. Yet despite that, Hollow Knight contained good environmental storytelling and succeeded in terms of vibes and atmosphere. Hallownest was a once great kingdom that was reduced to ruin by a mind-altering infection that we, the player, need to purge. The world felt haunted, every corridor echoing with the ghosts of a fallen kingdom. I might not understand exactly who our vessel is and why we need to kill these dreamers, but it's still chilling to walk through the rain-soaked City of Tears, take in the peaceful sights of the fungal wastes, or try to get the hell out of the oppressive and claustrophobic Deep Nest. Conversely, Silksong's story makes no sense. Hornet is captured by a religious cult at the beginning of the game for unknown reasons and then immediately escapes. There's yet another corrupting influence poisoning the minds of common bugs and a new story framed around a holy pilgrimage to the grand citadel of Bells, but the land of Farloom feels like empty pageantry. Instead of just leaving, Hornet decides to metaphorically climb Mount Everest for no real reason. Her journey is less a thread and more a tangled knot, equal parts arbitrary and inscrutable. Without getting into spoilers, her presence actually winds up making things much worse. Hollow Knight also contained a supporting cast of many memorable personalities, even if they were a bit on the simple side. Characters like Cornifer and his always welcome cheery melody, Sly, who's obviously just your everyday regular shopkeep, Cloth, who went from a well-intentioned coward to a warrior who sacrifices herself in noble combat, Zote the Mighty and his 57 precepts, and of course, Dung Defender! In contrast, Silksong has no memorable characters. The new mapmaker is a less remarkable version of Cornifer. The new stag can't even speak. No one has a noteworthy character arc or anything to really draw you to them. Hollow Knight's soundtrack also massively played into the game's atmosphere by providing level-appropriate themes and memorable earworms. Some of my favorite songs were ones like The Pleasant Stroll Through Green Path, or The Unsettling March to the Top of Soul Sanctum, followed by its bombastic orchestra when you fought the boss. Silksong's music, while certainly not bad, is nowhere near as memorable. I couldn't hum a single tune from the game if you paid me to. The result of all this is a game that looks and sounds like Hollow Knight, but too often plays like a mean-spirited parody. Some players will push through, master its systems, and proclaim it a worthy successor. It'll be someone's magnum opus and someone else's aggravating chore. For me, it was both, often in the same hour. Despite my many gripes, there's definitely a lot to like here, especially if you were already a fan of Hollow Knight. If you told me Silksong was your new favorite game of all time, I'd completely understand. And if you told me Silksong was horribly designed garbage, I'd completely understand. I felt the same way going from Hollow Knight to Silksong as I did going from Dark Souls to Elden Ring. I enjoyed a lot of my time with the game despite its flaws, but I'll never play it again. Silksong isn't a disaster, but it isn't a triumph either. It's a patchwork quilt of both brilliance and blunders, woven with silk but fraying at the seams.